Thank you very much for coming, everyone, today. Thank Daryl for giving us a great presentation to kick things off, as well as our sponsors. My name is Greg. I am the Manager of Employee Engagement and Labor Relations with Diversified Transportation here in Fort McMurray. Today we're going to be talking a bit about employee engagement. I know not a lot of you are HR people or have a couple of HR duties, so we're going to start right from the beginning. We're going to be talking about what is employee engagement, what contributes to it, how can we measure it, and then how can we take that forward, and what are some action plans. And I've got a couple of ideas on where to start for you guys as well. Before we get started too far, I have to apologize. I made a faux pas while titling my presentation. I used the D word, data. I always was told you have to keep it interesting to kind of get people's attention. And the one thing I've known is that as soon as you mention data or research, it turns everybody off. So apologies for that. But for our context, data just means information. And it's how do you guys get the information to be able to make a difference and make your workplaces a more positive place to be. So, what is employee engagement? There's a lot of definitions out there. This one I find is the most comprehensive, but maybe not the most attractive. So employee engagement is the emotional commitment an employee has to its organization and its goals. Essentially, how do you make people go that extra mile to help you succeed in what you're doing? So for employees, how does this look? You can always tell when an employee is engaged and when they're not engaged. When you have an engaged employee, they come in feeling excited about contributing, doing their jobs. They know where their place is in your organization. They feel like they're a valued member of the team. We all know people who are like this, and we all know people who are the exact opposite. The clock watchers, the people who put in that minimal effort and make sure that they get exactly the right amount of breaks during the day, and aren't really there when you need them to be. So, but it's also an organization that's got a lot, it's also a lot of employee who knows that they've got a lot of pride in their organization, that they know that they are coming in and making a difference every day. For employers, it's about creating that positive workspace. It's about using your employees as resources to create that improvement. They're the ones coming up to you and making those suggestions on how you can lower your costs, improve your services. And in case of private sector employers, it's about becoming more profitable. But it's also about creating that deeper commitment with your employees. And we're going to see the effects of that in just a few minutes. So the argument I always hear is that it's work. It's not supposed to be fun. Whenever I mention employee engagement, people automatically think of, like Silicon Valley, where people have beanbag chairs and pool tables, and they can have the super flexible schedules. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is more than just that checklist exercise. It's more than just about doing putting someone's picture up on the wall and calling them the employee of the month. It's not about trying to manipulate people. It's about making it an authentic experience. It's about not making necessarily people happier, because you're never going to make people always happy. But it's also not about employee satisfaction either. You've got a job, you've got services that you need to provide, and that's not going to change. But what you can do is you can change the work environment around that to make it a bit more positive. So the key here, though, is it needs to be sincere and it needs to make sense in your context. What's going to work for a private sector employer is not necessarily going to work for the food bank, and what's going to work for the food bank isn't necessarily going to work for the municipality. Each of you have your own individual workplace cultures, your values, and you need to work within that context. Okay? So why is it important? These percentages are just averages. I kind of debated whether to include them or not. If you're interested in more about how they got to these numbers, all my research comes from the HCI and the CEB. But organizations that see more engaged employees than non-engaged employees see decreases in absenteeism, turnover, and safety incidents, increases in customer service, productivity, sales, and profitability. And it's amazing. I've actually looked into it for what diversified would look like. Just a decrease in absenteeism alone generates huge savings. But I know, especially here in Fort McMurray, the decrease in safety incidents, especially if you have any connection to industry, is a huge factor and will save you not only time and money, but it also potentially generate more opportunities for you to connect with an industry. Anyone else see any potential upsides to engaging your employees? People who are more engaged tend to be more aware of their surroundings, put more emphasis on their field level risk assessments, and are just, how can I put it, chronic unease. They have that sense of chronic unease, so that they're always aware of what potential risks may be about. Complacency comes when you're more disengaged. No? Okay. So now I kind of copied this slide from another presentation I did. So why is it an issue for, I guess, everybody as opposed to just my company? Well, look at our current situation. We're in a current down economy. That leads to lower morale. You might have experienced several rounds of layoffs or lost a contract, which means other people have had to pick up that slack. So you've got increased workload, which means increased stress levels, compensation freezes maybe, but there's also nowhere else to go. So what are people going to do? They're going to grow resentful where they're at. It creates a very demotivating work environment, and these perceptions are going to stick around and continue even after the economy starts to turn around. What we're doing here in this case is we're laying the foundation for a problem later on once things start to pick up. So in the future situation, we're going to start to see, as the economy starts to come back, an increase in compensation in the market. We're going to see the job markets begin to heat up a little bit. Mind you, the recovery is not going to be necessarily as hot as it was before, but it's going to lead to our grass is greener syndrome. That's going to increase that's where your turnover comes from and your higher recruitment and training costs. I guess I should say the downtimes are the perfect time to actually start your engagement strategies. You don't have the rush of new business coming in. You can lay that foundation properly, put the attention that you need to it, so that when business does come back, you've already set that foundation for a positive workspace. Any questions about that so far? Does this make sense? Yeah, a few nods, okay. So, employee engagement just isn't one factor. There's not a single silver bullet that's actually going to make your employees want to come to work and give you that extra effort. When we've done surveys, Daryl pointed to a couple, and those are definitely true. When I kind of looked at the research, a lot of it's making sure you're providing the adequate resources, that you're not overtaxing your employees, but they've also got the materials that they need to do their job. Making sure you're communicating realistic performance expectations. Just communicating performance expectations, that's a big part of it too. Having that future orientation. You're not looking at necessarily what's happened always in last year, but you're looking at what are the plans to get us into the position that we want to be next year. Being able to articulate your organization's goals, and a big one would be explaining the connection between, Sally and accounting and the success of the organization overall. These tend to have the biggest impact. Afterwards, there are other things that can happen as well, but they tend to have minimal or decreasing impact on what you can do. But these are like the big six. When I started to put together the employment strategy for my organization, I kind of boiled it down to four things. Strategic narrative, engaging managers, creating an employee voice, and integrity. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So strategic narrative. A strategic narrative is about creating that captivating story for your organization. What is it that you do? How is it important? What impact are you making on your community if you're a nonprofit, or even if you are a profit for that, or for-profit organization? Ensure that employees are aware of the narrative, so they know what your goal and your vision is. They know the plan on how you're getting there. They have clear, identifiable organizational goals that you're working towards, and that your leaders are connecting those organizational goals to each individual employee. Does anyone here have any examples of some of the strategic narratives that they've crafted at their own organizations? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I do a lot of work with the library, and they did something very similar back in the end of 2015, early 2016. Anyone else want to talk a bit about how they crafted their strategic narrative at their organization? No? Okay. The next one's engaging managers. I don't normally plug books, but this one's really good. It's been my Bible from when I started in my job. It's called Work Rules by Laszlo Bock. Laszlo Bock was the Senior Vice President for People Operations at Google up until recently. And he talked a bit about how one of the things that they did there was not necessarily focus on with their HR department on, creating that service center where people's letters are generated, but they focused on data and doing the research on their organization to figure out what works and what doesn't. A couple of years ago, they did a major project called Project Oxygen. Is anyone familiar with Project Oxygen? Might have read about it. What they did is they looked at, one aspect of it was that they wanted to prove that managers don't really matter. That you can have a great team of people who know their stuff, and that the leader doesn't matter at all. Their idea here was it's kind of like the Dilbert comics, where you have a lot of really smart engineers who can do their work, and then you have some guy in an office somewhere who doesn't really know what's going on, who's just there to cause problems. And in fact, they were able to prove the exact opposite. What they did is they looked at over 1,000 managers in their teams, and they did some data collection. They found out, and they were able to categorize their managers into one of 4 groups. They looked at their worst managers, they looked at their best managers, they looked at teams that were performing really well but were unhappy, and teams that were not performing as well but were really happy. And they then redeployed their management team, and then just monitored where their employees what projects the employees wanted to move to. And you saw exactly what you'd expect. Teams and projects that had bad managers saw an outflow of employees, and the managers that really knew their stuff, was really able to work well with the groups, saw an influx into their teams of people who wanted to apply. Now, in their organization, they do have a little bit more flexibility on work assignments. You can, if there's a work opening, you can apply for it and you can move fairly easily. I know that's not necessarily the case, but it was a really interesting example of an organization that was able to kind of see what their employees' preferences were. And so that's where this comes in. So managers are one of the biggest driving factors of engagement and performance. A great manager can lead to somewhere in the range of 5 to 18% in an increase in engagement. And will significantly reduce your turnover and increase your productivity and work efficiency. So they actually were able to look at the engagement levels for the organization as the whole, and then they also measured individual teams as well. So, if you were to do this within a smaller organization, you could look at the engagement levels within your finance team versus, your sales team. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So they were able to basically distill it down to 8 major behaviors that a great leader does. And that's be a good coach, empower your team, not micromanage them, express interest in your team members' success and personal well-being, be very productive or results-oriented, help the team with career development, have a clear vision for what your team is supposed to accomplish, and have important technical skills so that when your team members come to you for advice, you can actually advise them in a knowledgeable way. And one of the great things that they've done is they've actually created that management training program around those behaviors. They did a 2-day program where they focused on the mindset of leadership, emotional intelligence, how to transition from being a frontline employee to a manager, coaching, feedback, and decision making. And then they published it online. So this is that's a free resource now if you want to use it. It's at Rework. The website's called Rework. I've actually used it, and we've modified it for our situation. And so I'd recommend it if you are an organization that doesn't necessarily train your leaders. Definitely take a look at this because it's been helpful for us and it's been helpful for other organizations. Any questions about engaging leaders? Was what I'm saying making sense, first of all? That people need a great leader in their for their team to be able to succeed. Okay. Any questions about the effects of leaders on a team or anything? Okay. All right. The third thing I kind of point out is create an employee voice. So what is this? This is it's creating those opportunities to have that two-way conversation within your organization. It's not just enough to have an open door policy where people can come in and talk. It's about making sure employees are comfortable enough to come in and actually talk to you about stuff. Suggestions on how to do this, we use town halls as a great example. We do them 2 or 3 times a year. And our senior leaders are there in the room giving updates on what's going on within our organization, answering questions, as well as helping reinforce that strategic narrative that we discussed. Other ideas are suggestion boxes or electronic suggestion boxes. Creating those scheduled regular time with your supervisors and your employees so that they can talk about what's going on, areas of concern or ways that they want to see the organization improve, or employee forums, which are a little bit, which are similar to town halls but a little less structured. And again, depending on what context you're in and the size of your organization, some of these are going to be great and some of them aren't going to be as great of a fit. But this is just a starting point for you to figure out how to have that two-way conversation. So just as important as having that forum for discussing issues or ideas with your employees, it's about showing and demonstrating that follow-up that's occurring. So your leaders need to be accountable for actually following through. At least, and not every suggestion is going to be great, but the fact that you've actually looked into it, you've made a determination if it's applicable at the moment or maybe later on or not at all, will go a long way with encouraging more people to make those suggestions. Ways that we've done this, for example, we've created a committee of our employees to be able to come through, to follow through on some of the suggestions that do get made at our town halls or through our suggestion boxes. And then through that committee, we're able to do that evaluation ourselves. And then we make sure that those results get communicated back at our next town hall. What about you guys? What do you guys do to encourage that two-way conversation? Or even just a regular team meeting, right? Again, you're just creating those opportunities for those conversations to happen because, as you put it, like people see a closed door and they might be thinking the wrong thing. They might think that you're not interested in talking to them today, but really you're right. It could be just someone's got the radio playing loudly out in the hall. So it really is just about creating those opportunities that are right for you and right for your organization. And then also being able to demonstrate that you care about what they're saying and that they're following up on it. Lastly, it's about integrity. This one's a big one. It's one that you're not going to happen overnight, that's for sure. And that's about setting and enforcing and reinforcing those behavioral expectations within your organization. This is about, you've talked the talk when you created your strategic narrative. Now it's about walking that walk. A lot of the organizations that see a lot of employee engagement tend to be more honest and open-minded, responsive, and ones that share information. And so that means you might have to break down a few silos between your different departments or between your different leaders, but it's definitely worth doing. I find that a big part of that is just making sure that you are being consistent with the messaging that you're giving. So if in your employee forums or in your team meetings, you're sending out the messages that, hey, we want to have your feedback, we want to hear from you, and then no follow-up happens, or that you've got your closed door the entire time, that's going to be providing some mixed messages to your employees. And so just being consistent is going to go a long ways. One part that was really key within our organization was having that dedicated on the floor time for seniors. So we have is a driver's room where drivers come in, they check in for their piece of work that day. They download their maps. They take a look at the schedule. They might talk with a couple of their drivers, have a cup of coffee. Having our senior leaders schedule some time in every week to go in, have a conversations. Doesn't necessarily have to be anything serious, but just how are you doing? Just making that effort of being there and outside of their normal schedules to go and talk with these guys goes a really long way to building that relationship of trust. So that way, when they do have an issue, they're more likely to come up and take advantage of your open door policy. Now on the floor time tends to work in a little bit more of an industrial setting, but even within small organizations, just going about talking to the people who are, doing your AP and AR, taking a little time just to see how their day is going to go a long way to help them create that. Does anyone else have like an on the floor time policy that they use? Yeah. And that's a really big piece of it too. And that goes back to showing that you've got the technical skills for the job, right? I'll use a friend of mine, he's our operations center manager. So he's the guy who manages our schedulers, our dispatchers, and the frontline folks who interact with the drivers. And he did make sure over the course of a month that he goes to every single location during every single shift and either sits with or does the job of one of our base controllers or schedulers or dispatchers, just to be able to show that he's there, he's aware of what they're doing, he can do the job himself, help them understand what their perspective is during the course of their day. So that's a really great example. Thank you. Okay. No, and there's a reason for that. Okay. So as I've been saying, perception here is reality. It's not just enough to be able to walk the walk or talk the talk. You need to have both going on at the same time. People need to be able to not only know that you're doing, to see that you're doing the things, but they also need to know that you're doing it and you're communicating it out there. Remember, this isn't necessarily bragging. But there's no valor in keeping everything low key and behind the scenes. The effects of you making that effort on your employee group is going to go a long way to making sure that they feel that they're cared about and that you care about their success. I know with a couple of our leaders, they've actually been more the behind the scenes kind of guys, and they're great people, but the perception that they've had put out there is that they're a little bit more of the grumpier kind of person, especially in our shops. But in fact, they do take a special interest in their employees. And when people do get to know these leaders, they can see that, but that's not the first impression that they necessarily give off. So we've been working with them a little bit on improving that and putting those proper perceptions out there. Okay, so now we get down to the data part. We need to understand when we're looking at employee engagement, where our organization is. Not only within our organization, our finance team is more engaged than our sales team, but also how do we compare to other organizations in the marketplace. So this would be where you can look at, if you're doing survey work, you can get benchmarking data from other organizations. You can participate in surveys. I know a lot of the nonprofits get together and do something like this. But we also need to understand the demographics of it too. So if overall our organization's pretty engaged, but there's a significant minority of people who are not engaged, we need to understand why that is, and we need to be able to target those folks to be able to, because that's where we're going to see our biggest impact, is taking those people who are actively disengaged and moving them up to a moderately engaged level. We need to know what's actually engaging people, and we need to know what the areas that we can improve on are. And we need to be able to take that information and make it as specific as possible so that we can drive as big of an impact as we can. So we talked a little bit about methods so far. The big ones are surveys, pulse checks, focus groups, and interviews. Surveys are those larger interviews or larger surveys that you might have been part of in other organizations. I know my first employee engagement survey when I did it happened every 2 years, and it was a 250 question survey. And it was run by, I think, Deloitte or Aon. And you want to know something that is completely disengaging, it's a 250 question survey. It would have been fine, but it's a 250, that's my limit. These are typically very comprehensive. They ask questions in multiple different ways. They reverse it from making it a positive question to a negative question so that they can compare the validity of the data. They tend to be more expensive, but you can do this on the cheap if you need to. You can use Google and one of their applications, or you can use SurveyMonkey and get that value while still having a valid survey. We'll talk a little bit about how to phrase your questions as well to make sure that you're not biasing your data. Chris mentioned pulse checks, those little 3-question surveys you can send out. The difference between a pulse check and a survey is, of course, the size, but also the length and frequency that you do it. So instead of 250 questions, you only do 3. Instead of maybe doing it once every 2 years, you're doing a pulse check much more regularly. It could be every day, as in Chris's example. It could be once a week or once a month. But you're getting consistent data more frequently. Focus groups and interviews, again, very similar, but it's a matter of what scope you want to do and how much time you want to invest into it. Focus groups are larger groups of people that you come in and you kind of have a facilitated, semi-structured conversation with folks. There's definitely going to be some things that you want to do and some topics that you want to address, but you're there to really kind of get the free-flowing conversation going. Interviews are much more one-on-one, maybe 2-on-1, and again, you're using structured, open-ended questions to be able to get that information you want. Both of these strategies provide positives and negatives. The nice thing about a survey is that you can kind of combine those Likert scale questions, those how much do you agree with this statement on a scale of 1 to 5, which provides you very focused information, to open-ended questions, where you get a little bit more anecdotal, but it's a little harder to put together at the end of it. While interviews tend to be more just those open-ended, structured questions. When you look at who should be participating, you don't necessarily need to ask every employee in your organization. At the food bank, for example, if you have 11 people, it might not be that hard to do. But when you get to an organization, where you've got maybe 50 or 100 people, you may not necessarily have to ask everybody who's there. But when you do decide to go with a sample method, make sure you balance your demographics. So you want proportional numbers of men and women. You want proportional numbers of people who've just joined the organization versus long-term employees. And you want representative numbers from different departments. This is supposed to be a snapshot of your organization, so just bear that in mind. Any questions about surveys, pulse checks, focus groups, interviews, or about creating a sample? We don't at Diversified. I have been part of organizations that have used them. A lot of the major consulting firms will do it, but there's also a lot of startup companies now that do the same sort of thing, where you can subscribe to their website and they will, you put in all of your employees' information and they'll send out an email link to the survey every now and then to the representative sample, which will be a little bit more cost effective for smaller organizations. And then, of course, you can also look at mobile app developers as well, because they'll have similar kind of tools. The only thing I'll caution is that make sure you look at the service agreements, because you may not necessarily own that data at the end of it. They'll provide you a report, but you're not going to be the one who actually owns that research data. And they may end up using it to help benchmark later on. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So what are some things to measure? We talked a bit about leadership and your strategic narrative, but those things are also important to measure, but also look at your trust levels in your managers, attitudes towards the company future. Like, if you think you as a leader, your organization's growing, expanding, is making an impact, but your employees don't, where's that disconnect happening from? And that's something that you can drill onto later. Look at how committed you are to your employees, or get the perception of how committed you are to your employees. And you can ask questions about things like training, compensation, career advancement opportunities, a whole host of factors in looking at this. Don't feel limited to just the typical compensation and career advancement and how good your leader is. Feel free to ask anything you want. Just again, it's about structuring the question to get the right kind of answer that you want. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Any other ideas you guys want to toss out about areas to measure for an engagement survey or an engagement interviews? Oh, okay. So you need to ask your questions in the right way. A question that's not properly structured is going to skew your results in one way or another. How awesome am I on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being awesome and 5 being great is not going to give you any actionable information. You also need to balance things. Yeah, you need to make sure that you're asking on one topic and one topic only if you're asking a Likert scale question. Is my manager trustworthy and honest on a scale of 1 to 5? Well, what happens if your manager is trustworthy but not honest, or honest and not trustworthy? So limit your questions to just one topic at a time. It may force you to add a couple questions to your survey, but it's worth it because you want to make sure you're getting the right data. Don't necessarily ask just positive questions all the time. Ask a couple negative questions or frame negative statements in yourself. So my organization doesn't care about me on a scale of 1 to 5. Or what are some things that my manager does or here are like the top 3 things my manager does to demotivate me in my job. You don't want to just paint a rosy picture of your organization at the time. You want to paint an honest one. When you're looking at interview and focus group questions, make sure that they're structured and open-ended. If you're running multiple focus groups or multiple interviews, you want to make sure you're asking the same questions over and over again because that's where your reliable data is going to come from. Now, you might get answers that are outside the box, and that's great, but you want to make sure that it's all within some sort of framework. And whenever somebody provides you an example of something in an open-ended question, always ask for examples. So do you feel like your manager cares about you? Well, no. Okay, well, why? And get them to give you those concrete examples. Those are going to be key because while people might have anecdotal or gut feelings about certain topics, that's not enough for you to craft your strategy on how to engage your employees on. You want to have that hard data to back it up. Well, my manager demotivates me because he comes in every morning and makes crude jokes, or he makes me feel uncomfortable at work because he always gives me the hardest work to do. Stuff like that, it's important to capture, but you need to have the concrete example. Okay, so when it comes time, now that you got your data, you kind of understand a little bit about where your organization is at, it's time to action it. Understand where your biggest impact is coming from. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you're not going to get your biggest impact from moving your middle group up to the highly engaged. So you're moderately engaged into the highly engaged. It's not where your impact's going to be. It's going to be coming from the tail end, the people who are actively disengaged or moderately disengaged, and moving them up on the scale a little bit to that more moderately engaged group. And you need to look for quick promotable wins initially so that people start to trust the process. Communication is a really easy place to start. So if you are, one of the things that you don't communicate frequently enough, increase the number of meetings that you've got or team updates, or maybe create a quick weekly newsletter that you can blast out on a Friday afternoon so people know what's going on. People seeing those changes will start to trust the process more, and so that when it comes time for building a trusted culture or a culture of leadership, they'll give you that little leeway to be able to make those changes over a 6-month, 12-month, 18-month period. Lastly, don't be afraid of setbacks. If you try something and it doesn't work, setbacks just show that you're trying, and people will appreciate the effort. If something doesn't work, it might just need a tweak. And so you can come back to after going back to the drawing board and show people that you're actually going to try to relaunch something. All that's positive. We're trying to move the needle here on a perception game, and creating those perceptions that you're trying are going to be key. Okay, so We'll come to questions in a second. Let's take a look at our case study. I've taken this one from an example of a colleague of mine. The case study is about an electric company with a demotivated frontline employee a group that's very technically focused, but feels that just isn't contributing, isn't very engaged. So take a few minutes to read about the employee group, and then I want you guys in your tables to discuss how you'd actually go about measuring the engagement levels in this employee group. Yep. Oh, great ideas. Anyone else have anything they want to add before? Can I tell you what happened as an end result here? No? Okay. So you guys identified the two major factors of disengagement. That was the isolation within the company for the lines people, and also how they perceived interacting with their supervisors. This company did a couple things. One, they started to schedule events during that crossover period where the linesmen might be either coming on or off shift while their office staff were just coming on or off themselves. And so they were doing things like scheduling, company dinners or company potlucks or pancake breakfasts, just to create that sense of community between the two groups. They also implemented a job shadowing program. So, not everybody every year, but if you're interested in knowing more about the organization, you had the opportunity to go and follow along one of the salespeople, or if you were in the office, go follow along one of the linesmen for the day. So you kind of had an understanding of what the rest of the company was up to at any given point. And then when it came to the supervisors, they actually implemented almost not necessarily a mandatory recognition, but they emphasized recognition in their employees. So that whenever a supervisor was around anymore, it wasn't always going to be negative. It might be, a cause for concern. Something that might have come up, a safety incident, but it's also, you did a great job today. You might have, you built so much, amount of electrical line, or you did a really great job in identifying some safety hazards, and we were able to avoid an unsafe situation. So it was providing that recognition and also creating more opportunities for employees to interact, which really kind of helped start to engage those lines people. Two things I'm going to mention before I finish up for today. You'll notice that in my presentation, I not once mentioned compensation. Engagement really isn't about how much money you're making. It's about creating a meaningful workplace. It's about going in and knowing that you're making a difference, regardless of your role. You could be the CEO or you could be the janitor, but you're coming in and you're making a difference, and you feel like you're valued. So it really is about creating that internal motivation for people. And recognition is a really important part of that. And when we look at research, the monetary recognition may have a slightly higher impact on an employee's engagement or perceptions, but it fades extremely quickly. When you look at the non-monetary aspects of recognition, even if it's just pulling somebody up in front of a group, explaining what they did, and having them recognized in front of their peers, you see almost as high impact on the person's satisfaction and engagement, and then it maintains for a longer period of time before trickling off. And an interesting fact on top of that is that it not only impacts that one person, but it impacts their friends and their peer group as well. So you're not just recognizing that one employee, you end up recognizing 10 or 12. So just keep that in mind that, engagement's more about being internally motivated and valued within your organization. All right, and that's it for me for today. Does anyone have any questions?